Hi, and welcome to the KindlED Podcast, where we dig into the art and science behind kindling the motivation, curiosity, and mental well-being of the young humans in our lives.
Together, we'll discover practical tools and strategies you can use to help kids unlock their full potential and become the strongest version of their future selves. Welcome to the KindlED Podcast. Hey, Katie, how's it going today?
So good, how are you?
I don't just want to say good because I feel like that's lame when I'm just like, I'm just good. I don't know, I'm ecstatic.
We should make like a random how are you generator where you'll click the button and you'll just say whatever word comes up. That'd be fun.
I love it. Or it's kind of like the big emotions wheel. Have you ever seen that? And my therapist, she has a pillow, which is brilliant because it's like the wheel on top of this big pillow that you can squeeze and sit on and hold on. And then anytime I'm looking for, I need one of those in my office. But looking at your yellow shirt makes me feel lots of joy inside my body right now.
Do you think that it looks like I just want to go on a picnic? Because I just feel like a giant picnic blanket. If you're just listening to this on Spotify or Apple or whatever, you might want to check the YouTube out because I'm pretty much wearing like a giant picnic blanket. Usually I'm like all about like navy and gray, and anytime my mom gets me a Christmas present that's closed, she's like, it's gray, so you like it. I'm like, not wrong, Mom, you're not wrong. And so for me to be wearing a yellow shirt is a bit out of character, I will say, but it's just because I'm so excited about our guest today.
Yes, and I feel like her name has joy in it, and that's the feeling I get when I see you wearing yellow. I love bright colors, and there is a thing called dopamine dressing.
You've told me about that, and I want to know more about it because whatever that is, I'm not doing that for sure, unless like neutrals and navy elicit dopamine, and I don't think it does.
I don't think it does either. Okay, Katie, so who are we talking to today?
Today we are talking to a good friend of mine, Joanna Lovejoy. Joanna Lovejoy, a trailblazer in edtech innovation, has been instrumental as a founding member of Alpha, Austin Deep Academy, and Kinjo, effortlessly fusing academic principles with the vibrant energy of technology and unconventional sectors. She rejuvenates student engagement in education. Tapping into her vast industry insight, Joanna designs frameworks that elevate and extend beyond the confines of traditional learning. As the Director of Technology Integration at Alpha, she showcased her unwavering dedication to harnessing adaptive technologies. True to her vision, Joanna seamlessly bridges academia and gaming with her work at Kinjo, standing as a testament to her ability to curate transformative learning experiences.
We are so excited to talk to Joanna today. Let's get into the show. Welcome to the podcast, Joanna. It's so nice to meet you.
Hi, it's nice to meet you too.
Before we get started, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to the work you're currently doing. So what is your big why?
So I started working in education in 2018, and honestly, I don't think I found my why until a few years into my journey. I had a particular student who came to Alpha and was pretty behind in reading and math. And he was so determined to get better scores and just to kind of catch up to his peers that I think he became my why in that moment. I think when you see somebody who's so hungry to want to improve and is so dedicated and willing to fail over and over again and pick themselves back up, that it's just inevitable that you're going to fall in love with the journey of education. And I was super excited to see his success throughout the years.
What is Alpha?
Alpha is a K-12 startup school in Austin, Texas. It's definitely more on the innovative side. I think we would kind of call it a micro school to start off with. So it had a fairly small student population, and it's, I think, interesting in its sector because we don't have any formal teachers. So they really solely relied on academic adaptive technology. And then we would have guides who would facilitate workshops in the afternoon that would take the life skill components and tie them to the academics to kind of help bridge understanding for students.
So were you one of those guides, or what was your role at Alpha?
I did actually serve as a guide through various levels. So I worked as a lead guide in L2, and then I was a temporary lead guide for L4, which is their high school. But my primary role was director of technology integration. So my job was to kind of stay on the bleeding edge of the adaptive technology and figure out how we could utilize it effectively to supplement your traditional K-12 curriculum.
So what do you do now? Are you still at Alpha, or are you doing something different?
I left Alpha last year and I am working at a startup called Kinjo. Kinjo is kind of at this intersection of gaming and education. So we are really looking to tackle the problem of screen time. How do we make it more effective? And how do we tap into kind of the natural curiosities of children to kind of pull out the learning that's happening in these environments that they spend copious amounts of time in?
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. So there's a term in education, blended learning, which is where, I mean, you can tell us all about that. Are you talking about blended learning? Like define blended learning and then answer the question, is what you're talking about blended learning or something different?
I would say my time at Alpha is definitely blended learning. Blended learning is when you bring in, I guess, various technologies into the classroom to supplement some of the teaching. So it's the combination of really thoughtful and innovative technology with a teacher or somebody who's facilitating the learning. Kinjo is slightly different because really what we're saying is that the kids are already learning in these gaming environments. And what we are trying to do is act as intermediate between what is happening in education, what is happening in gaming, and what is happening at home, what parents are observing. How can we create the language that takes the child experience in the game, kind of gives validity to what the game developers have created? And then how do we merge that with what we know about life skill development and present that information to parents in a way that gives them, I guess, more comfortability and peace of mind that their kids aren't actually wasting all their time in these environments that are totally useless.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So how would you describe the typical parent's perspective or opinion about gaming? Is it accepted that it can be educational, or is this like a hill that you have to kind of overcome?
Definitely a hill. I think everybody's first response, especially to anything related to screen time is just automatically bad. And I think what I've learned at my time in Alpha and what I see daily at my time in Kinjo is that thoughtful screen time can make the world a difference. Thoughtful technology, whether that is adaptive technology to learn science principles, or in the case of we're using Roblox to teach things like budgeting and time management and resource allocation. If the technology, I guess, is understood effectively, implemented correctly, and has a solid framework, it actually becomes a really powerful tool that can enhance the learning that the kids are doing.
Are the kids as drawn to learning how to budget and things in Roblox than, Prison Break or these games that we no longer allow in our house? No, that because my kids could not think of anything else and kept having to go on there. So I'm just curious if you're seeing that kids are having that same amount of interest. And I don't know if I want to use the word obsession, but I do see that there's like kind of an obsession with some of these games too. So I would love to break that down a little bit more, especially with Roblox.
Yeah, I think you say obsession, I would say intrinsic motivation.
There we go.
I feel like, two sides of the same coin in some respect. Do I think that kids are getting on the experiences in Kinjo, understanding first and foremost that they are learning things like budgeting and time management? Not at this stage. They feel like they're playing their games. And what we've done is created a pretty comprehensive system with a rubric that looks at complexity, which is the mechanics that gamers choose to put in the game, and life skill development. And we've created a mapping system so we know if a mechanic is represented in a game, that we can tie that to a life skill. Whether that your children or any children have the language to understand what they're doing is kind of the thing that I would wave my flag on. There is a lot of times where kids are doing things intuitively in a game, and we have deemed this as a pastime, as fun, as this space where they can like go and rest their mind. And what Kinjo is seeking to do is actually give parents the language to help them pull those skills outside of the game. My favorite example for the gaming community is there's a game genre called roguelites. And essentially you have a child who is combating like enemies. So there's a lot of, like weaponry and fighting. They're collecting loot along the way. But what's really interesting is if you have a good roguelite, the developer has chose to put in this mechanic called permadeath and procedural generation. They typically work together. Permadeath means that when I die, all of my progress is lost. There is no save element. And procedural generation means that when I come back into the environment for that run, the map has actually changed. Now, you are seeing your child probably lose their mind. They're tapping the screen, they're yelling, they're so frustrated. And you'll see them do that over and over and over again. On our end, we're measuring things like adaptability, grit and resilience, problem solving, because we know that every time they are taking on that challenge, they are basically doing the calculation of, man, I messed that up, I have to do better. What does this map have similar to the map that I just did before? So if we can give parents the language that says, here's what's actually happening on a cognitive level, then you can go back to your child and say, hey, you were doing so great with resilience and adaptability and problem solving. How about we also work on emotional regulation? When you're super frustrated, what is the tactic that we can use here? All of a sudden, your experience with your child is not, okay, give me the iPad, you're done. It's, wow, let's celebrate this moment together and tell me how you solved this challenge that took you 7 tries. I don't think any parent would want to say that 7 tries isn't worthwhile for an experience. It's just that do both parties come to the table with the right language?
That's a huge paradigm shift, and you are speaking directly to a parent that struggles with this. I feel like I've mentioned this on the podcast a lot. And as you were talking, I was like, oh, it's not Prison Break. I think it's called Jailbreak. So just all of those out there that actually play Roblox, I'm very sorry. I got the name wrong. But this is really fascinating to me that we can pull out the skills. Because I know that there is learning. And I have to say, like my younger brother, he was a big gamer. He still is at 30 years old. And that's how he even learned basic skills like his letters and numbers and playing Mario. And I did see that there was some learning, but the emotional regulation is a really big piece of the puzzle that's really hard with such underdeveloped brains to have those skills because of just how much dopamine is released and all the different biochemicals that are released in the brain. But I love that you're helping me go, okay, there is still a lot of education in this. There's still a lot of learning that is happening. I need to focus on how I'm communicating it to my child and pulling that out. So I absolutely love that. And I appreciate you mentioning that.
I think it would be really interesting if we developed a game where like the iPad or whatever the device is could measure how hard you're hitting it and could like monitor. I mean, obviously it can measure the sound, like how loud are you screaming? Because then it could give you feedback about your emotional regulation. Where it's like, wow, you failed and you stayed calm. That would be amazing if like you're getting points for like overcoming with tranquility.
There is an app called Mightier, and they have, I think that's even like hooks you up to a pulse ox, and you can, measure like your heart rate. And that's what we discovered with my son is his heart rate goes through the roof compared to most kids his age playing a game. So it's like, okay, now when he's playing, his psychologist has used Mightier to help him to take deep breaths, take breaks. His eyes, like it really affects his visual processing. And so I'll see him like if he's playing, but again, there's so much education in these games, not just, oh, my kid's just playing video games. So I'd like to back up a little bit too and talk more about like the broad technology space. So what would you say is like the role of technology in most schools today? What do you think technology use should be in schools? And then where do we go wrong with technology in education?
What a great question. I think currently, if I'm looking at public schools, charter schools, even higher ed, technology really feels like an accessory. It's kind of thrown in there for decoration. There's actually this really great study that was published in 2019 called the EdTech Genome Project. And the reason that I like this study so much is because it looked at all of the money that's wasted with poor adoption. So if you think about it, you have administrators, you have students, you have teachers who are all stakeholders, I guess, in the technology that you're putting in front of them. And what ends up happening is that somebody, me, right? For Alpha, I go and I evaluate this product and I select it. And then I'm like, okay, great. Now you have to use it. Alpha was really great because we trained all of our guides. We had like extensive resources. It was what we did. So every person was on board. But in a normal school setting, not everybody is going to have the time, the incentive, or even the common language to dissect the technologies that are being incorporated. I would say moving forward, I think technology should be seen kind of as, a student aid, a second teacher in the classroom, because it allows the actual teacher to do the thing that I think humans do best, which is intrinsically motivate those in front of them. And there are some pitfalls with technology. I know that in my time at Alpha, there are times where I'm walking around and I can see a student getting so frustrated at missing this Excel concept, and they are just hammering through it. As a human, I can go by and I can say, hey, why don't we take 2 seconds? Like, let's take a deep breath. Did you remember to scroll down the page, because they give you an explanation? Where's your notebook? That's what I can do to motivate that child. If I know them on a personal level, I can, come in with some of those like short pieces. How was your day? How's your basketball game? Those things. What technology does far better, I think, than any human can do is it can deliver content at the right amount of time with the right amount of complexity, and it can scaffold these learning experiences on an individual level. If I tried to do that in a classroom, I'm going to be so overwhelmed. I have 30 kids with 30 different needs, and technology can do that effectively. I think for administrators or people who are in my position who are selecting the technology, honestly, the best thing you can do is go and live the experience of the student and the teacher. If you can get teacher adoption, I would say that that is literally 70% of the problem, because if the teacher believes in the technology, if they feel comfortable with it, if they have the right support system, they will speak to the kids, right? And they're kind of the cheerleader for all things that are happening in the classroom. And then looking at the child experience, there were many, many times where we adopted different technologies that the kids just didn't like. And we either weighed the academic pros and cons of it, is this worthwhile? Or we looked for an alternative tool. We were smaller, so we could exchange those things quicker. But even in a larger school, I think student feedback has to be at the center of what it is that you're bringing into the classroom, because ultimately they're the ones that you want to kind of take with it and run and learn from it. And if they dislike that experience, you're not going to have long-term retention.
You had said academics pros or cons. So I'm thinking of my eighth grader. He goes to a hybrid school. So it's half online, half in person. I think that human aspect is huge. And he does have access to a lot of these learning tools. So NitroType and GimKit and IXL that they use alongside. But what I find sometimes, especially with GimKit and NitroType, is it becomes more of the game, and the academic piece starts to get lost, and he just becomes obsessed. So I have to log in today because I'm going to get so many points, and I'm going to get this car and this vehicle. And I'm like, but you're supposed to be typing. So I think it goes back to kind of where I guess he is still, he's typing like 45 words per minute. So maybe this is a me thing that I have to like get over. But I'm like, I want still that academic, and it becomes so much about the game. But I kind of, do you feel like that's still okay because they're still learning? It doesn't have to be like, oh, well, this is academics.
I think you touch on kind of like a very common parent, it's not a problem, but a parent opinion, which is that you expect school to be the same way that you experienced it. And I think a lot of times parents get lost in the fact that they're not bonding with their child over this shared experience, that they kind of miss the whole point, which was, did you actually enjoy sitting in a desk for 8 hours a day? Like, how was your school experience really? If you genuinely were to think about it, could you do it again today? Can you go sit in a classroom and be shuffled from one space to the next space? So I think in terms of, the typing games, he's typing. That's all that matters. If he wants to collect his coins, that ed tech product, I think, did a phenomenal job, because it's a game first. And if that's how your son's thinking about it, that's what we want, because now he's motivated to get on there, regardless of if it's typing or not typing. I think where I would pick on some technologies is when they've taken gamified learning to an extreme, which is that the child understands that the gamified elements are not genuine. And so instead of being able to click through the lesson like I want to, I have to go through all these hoops and hurdles because it's a game, but not really. I think, this is kind of where I see Kinjo sitting at this kind of like nexus, which is we have developers who are phenomenal at creating these addictive games. I'm sure, you have Angry Birds on your phone, or if you're a gamer, you're obsessed with Fortnite. They're really good at that, which is amazing. And how do we leverage the fact that you have people who want to spend hours and actual currency, sinking time into those spaces? How do we give them a framework for learning that they can then build into the game? Instead of saying, here's a framework for learning, now let's pretend or try to make this fun. Why don't we let the experts in fun make it educational? So kind of shifting that responsibility.
That's interesting. So do you see like app-based learning as a solution for all kids, or is this a subset of kids that we can take this approach with?
I would say the vast majority of kids can learn with app-based learning. I do think that there are some kind of prerequisite skills that make it easier for some kids. And I do feel like a lot of it has to do with the help at home. I really still believe in this notion that it's a village that raises a child. And if you have a parent at home who is prone to jumping in to save the day, basically not allowing their child to fail, app-based learning becomes really hard for them. In app-based learning, you have to remember that they are throwing a dart at a board maybe 15, 20 times before it's going to click. And the app, if it's well structured, if it's been evaluated correctly, should have all the scaffolding to catch your child. And sometimes the best way to learn is to learn through failure and to make sure that your child understands that it's okay to fail. I think in a normal setting, when we think of failure, we're like, oh my gosh, you failed this test. Well, every lesson is like this mini test, and it's okay if they fail the lesson, because there's going to be another lesson that is going to bridge the misunderstanding. I think this is one of the reasons why adaptive technology lends itself so well to mastery-based learning.
Do you see that applies to real life? Because I have a child who he will get frustrated playing a game. However, he's okay with failing and picking back up and keep going. But in real life, failure is so hard. So it's like, how do we bridge that gap of, okay, it's okay to fail, and I'm going to learn from my failure in this video game, but then applying it to real life, how do we help with that bridge?
Yeah, I think this really is like a parent-child conversation, because I think when we think of failing in a video game, the stakes are very low. And we have intentionally as a society made it seem that way, right? Like, oh, you can go fail in this game. It doesn't matter. It's your free time. It's fun. It's something I'm going to take away if you're misbehaving. Whereas in real life, failure is seen as a failure, right? It is like kind of a mark on your worth as a human. And I really think that is something that has to be shifted. It's okay if you fail a test, because at least we know the 13 things that you have to go work on. Right now, when we're measuring students, I guess, in terms of grades or achievement in sports, it's very much do or don't. And so their own opinion of their worth is really like, did I do a good job or did I fail? But life is this beautiful grayscale. There are times where you're going to, be super successful, and there are times where you're not going to be. And the truth is that most of the time, if you fail in life, somebody is there to pick you up and scoot you along and dust you off and say it's okay. And I think that's like some language that we have to give kids, which is even though we want you to do your best, sometimes doing your best is still going to result in failure, and that's okay.
Yeah, I love that picture that you just painted for us about what success looks like, because we use a ton of adaptive technology at Prenda, and you mentioned this as like a secondary teacher. At Prenda, it's really the primary instruction, and there are supplemental things that we do to scaffold and push kids along and support them. But the apps are really for their individualized mastery-based core academics, like their primary teacher. And in that situation, we have some parents who end up leaving Prenda because they feel like their kid, it just wasn't a fit for their kid. Like their kid didn't learn well that way. And sometimes I wish I could go watch that situation where it's not working and push pause on time and like do some coaching around what success looks like. Yeah, they didn't get it that time, but they tried 7 more times, and then they're still in it. And redefining what success looks like, because it's different learning with apps than it is with a teacher, where you have like 1 or 2 opportunities to understand the content, and then 1 opportunity to demonstrate your knowledge, like on a homework assignment or quiz, and then you move on. It's very different than that. And I think that in the future, we're going to be seeing a lot more we can talk about AI, or a lot more computer app-based learning being more of the primary instructional tool. And so I think this is something we really need to get our heads around as parents and educators. So what are your thoughts on that? What skills does the child need to be successful? And how can we as parents and educators look at that situation with maybe a new lens on what success looks like?
I think early skills for student success when looking at something online is genuine curiosity. I think to your point, I did say it as like a secondary teacher. The truth is that most of these ed tech products are not designed to replace teachers at this stage. So I think that's kind of the first thing that we have to say, which is as technology improves, as these things are designed to be teacher replacements in the sense that they're delivering content, not necessarily motivating and coaching and shaping, as technology becomes better, I guess, at like delivering content in a way that they're replacing teachers, I think there's a few things that we can prepare students for now, and I guess in the future. The skills that I think are most important, curiosity, because we do know that these apps aren't designed to replace the teacher, which means that there are times where I'm going to have to go find the answer. And if I'm not curious about the answer, I'm going to get really frustrated with the prompting of this service not delivering it to me. The second is, I think, being able to ask good questions. This is a skill that I think is just not taught, which is how do you actually get to the root of where you're like, I don't understand. We did this exercise in Alpha a lot where we would take a question that a kid was particularly stuck on. They wanted guide support. And we would say, okay, well, do you know this part? And we would, underline the first half of the question. And they'd be like, yeah, I got that. I'm like, okay, do we understand this? Like, do you get what the question is asking? And they're like, yes. And I'm like, okay, do we know how to set the problem up? And by the end of it, really the thing that they were struggling with was, oh, I forgot how exponents work. I can get all the way through the question. I can set it up as a problem. And the thing that I'm really struggling with is exponents. Now we have a really good worded question. It is a 2-second Google search, and that child was able to do it without me there. I may have been able to prompt them through determining how to ask that question, but I don't have to do that every time. It's a learned skill. So curiosity, being able to ask questions, aka understanding where my lack of knowledge is. And then I think the third is just resilience, growth mindset. It's all kind of the same, but it's really just being able to say, I failed. It's okay. I can accept it. And how do I move forward? Do I need guide support? Maybe I do need human intervention. Do I need to just pause and come back to it? I don't know how many times I've stared at something and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. And I come back and I'm able to fix it quickly.
Yeah, I love that you've pointed out there like a new role for that adult. I was just reading something that said that AI was going to, or like all of the stuff's going to replace teachers and stuff. I'm like, it changes what they do, but it doesn't remove the need for there to be a loving human there with you, scaffolding that experience, right? And I think that we can have, especially teachers, can see this as kind of threatening, right? Where it's like, no, I deliver the content, I learn the content, I'm going to deliver the content. I don't want to be replaced by a robot, which is something that, like, I'm pretty sure every human in the last few months has asked themselves if they're going to be replaced by a robot when you see like all of the cool things that AI can do. So I think that's a really important question that we kind of sit on and noodle on, because we're talking about the future of education and the future of millions of people's jobs. And I just love how you called out like the vital importance of that adult being there, to help with this emotional regulation, to develop the grit, to point out that they're not using all of their resources or asking themselves the wrong question. And I also love that you ended your example with, it was a 2-second Google search. It wasn't, and then the guide told them about exponents, right? We constantly we were nurturing that learning how to learn behavior, right? We were showing them how to get the answers to their own problems, because I think that one of the key elements here, we want to develop a relationship and not a dependence. There can be this kind of learned helplessness, like I need the teacher because I need them to come explain it to me because I don't have the resources or tools to go figure something out on my own. And that's like a belief or like state of heart almost that I see in a lot of kids. And it really sticks with you as you grow up and you're an adult and you try to get a job and you're just looking around for like the adult, and then you realize like I'm the adult in the room and I need to like man up and go figure this out. And that's one of our core values at Prenda, is figure it out. And you can do that in such a loving way as a guide. And that's such an impactful, powerful role to play in the life of a student or child.
It makes me wonder why we still have closed book tests and things that we have to memorize because our world, I mean, if you need to know anything, I mean, how many people have just little robots in their house that they, hey, Google, or hey, Alexa, like literally, if we need answers to something, we can just ask, but yet we're still making kids like memorize all these things. They regurgitate the information, and then how long does it stay in our memory banks? Not for very long.
Obviously, I'm very pro technology, and it's kind of comical because I think everybody close to me in my life sits in like a very traditional teaching role. My sister's a teacher at a middle school, for example. What I would say as like a comforting piece to teachers or anybody in the education space who's really worried about things like AI and technology is like the mind shift that needs to happen is going from management to a C-level exec position. As a manager, my job is to know all of the content inside and out, and I have to be an expert on the role. As a C-level executive, my job is to make sure that I've employed the right people, aka selected the right tools to do that job, and that what I can do, beyond selecting the right tools is making sure that I have a really thoughtful team put in place who is able to kind of pull out the right skills needed to support production. So in this particular case, I would just say, teachers, your life is about to get a lot easier. And it doesn't mean that you're not a content expert. It's just meaning that instead of needing to be nuanced in content, you are now able to actually look at the higher picture, right? We talk about whole child a lot. How much time do they actually have to look at the whole child when you're burdened with content?
You can't. You absolutely can't. And the burden of differentiation that you called out earlier, having a room full of 30 kids that are maybe they're all 9, but they're at 30 different zones of proximal development. They're learning frontiers, what we call it, Prenda. But to be able to differentiate that without like completely losing your sanity is like such a huge boon to the teaching profession. And I hope that we can like move forward in a way that's like really supportive of teachers and like it like really to see this like this is definitely an upgrade and something. I mean, the teacher burnout rate is crazy right now, and we like obviously there's a problem with that role and what's being put on all of those people and how they're being supported. So I have like the deepest respect for teachers. I, as a speech language pathologist, I used to go into rooms and I would pull my 1 or 2 kids to do my small group therapy and see this like amazing person just work in this room and doing her darndest to differentiate because she loves those kids so much and she knows that that's what's best. But it really is just so exhausting to be able to have to wear so many hats. And so I definitely see this as a way for the teacher to be able to get some of their mental sanity back, I guess.
You mentioned picking the right tools. So I would like to know, are there certain elements that parents and educators should be looking for when they're picking the right tool? And is there still differentiation we have to be thinking about within the tools and within the whole child? Because one tool may work for, I just feel like this gets very complicated.
Small answer, yes, very complicated. The rubric I created for Alpha, I think, was pretty exhaustive. I would say the first thing to look for is internal support. I think this is the easiest one. And the hardest piece here is it's not internal support for the educator. It's internal support for the child. I think a lot of times when we, or at least when I've talked to people in larger institutions who are selecting technology, they're really focused on the back end. What's easy for me? How do I grade? Can I get enough alerts? And I think they miss the student experience entirely. Do I have integrated support? Basically, if I fail a lesson, does it drive me to the next lesson automatically? Is there multiple forms of explanation? I'm going to pick on Khan Academy here. Khan Academy, I think, is kind of a one-trick pony when it comes to support. I'm going to get my like verbal explanation. It's pretty much going to be the same every type of problem minus the numbers being switched out. And then you look at something like Nori, which is really exceptional. They have a short video clip, 30 seconds. It goes right to the heart of the problem. Then you have a scaffolded breakdown so I can solve the problem step by step by step. And then if that doesn't work, it'll ping me to another lesson to make the recommendation where I have both of those supports there again. On the back end, for the teachers, you get to see how many times I tried the problem. So I think that's a win-win there. So I would say looking at student experience first. I would also say if the application is overly gamified, that is something that I have seen time and time again fail. We've tried to use things like Wowzers and Dreambox, and, we've gone through the gamut. And what we find is that if I'm a younger kid, maybe something like Dreambox is very appealing. It is a very short window between where that is fun and where I want to be like an adult. And I don't want all the bells and whistles because I know I'm still doing math. Right. So, like, let me get through my math lesson effectively.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between something like Khan Academy or something like Alex, something that's very adaptive. I think it's an important principle to understand if you're looking at engaging more with education technology, is this principle of adaptivity. But what you called internal support, and that's a new term for me. That was really interesting. So yeah, that's a big one.
I think adaptive is kind of a mixed bag for me, because there's adaptive where there's an internal algorithm that's going to kind of move me along a pre-designed pathway. There's adaptive where you can have teacher, I guess, intervention. I can slot in a lesson. And I think, something at Alpha that we really believed in was letting the technology do the work. So what does this pathway look like? I know that I believe I know what's best because I'm human and I always think I know what's best. But let's basically run through that. So I tend to avoid adaptive because I think at this stage, it means a lot of different things on a back end perspective, where for the student, I think it's more so, can I trust that this technology kind of is, cradling me along without needing to go and, get somebody else to intercede.
I love that. Okay, so let's talk about mastery-based learning. What is it? How's it different from what happens in school typically? And how can technology make mastery-based learning work in a classroom?
I'm going to use GT School as an example for mastery-based learning. GT School, for those of you that don't know, is kind of a gifted and talented driven online after school initiative. But they're really focused on mastery-based learning. Basically, how do we fill in the gaps of things that were lost in traditional school settings? So that way, by the time they graduate, they have a full and comprehensive understanding of the subject at hand. They started with math, which I think is always the easiest subject to start with. I think, to their credit, they were able to get it down very effectively. With that being said, mastery-based learning is really making sure that I understand the entire pie, or that my base on the pyramid is completely filled in. So what happens right now in traditional education is I will go to second grade here in Texas. I will learn addition, and then maybe I move schools and I'm now in third grade in Arizona, and they have assumed that I've mastered my 2-digit addition as well as 3-digit addition, and we're also going to add in this layer of multiplication. There is no comprehensive standard across these states that says, does Joanna, 1, actually know how to add 2-digit, 3-digit numbers? And 2, do I have time to make sure she really understands that before I introduce this concept of multiplication? So in mastery-based learning, we say you don't get to move on to multiplication until you have your foundation principles of addition really locked in. And that means that sometimes for high schoolers, they are going all the way back to first grade math to fill in those holes. And it was just one little thing that they missed. I think a lot of times we see this in geometry. So those principles, I think, in elementary school kind of go to the wayside. And then you get into high school geometry and you're like, I've never seen shapes before in my life. And so they have to go back and figure out, here's the diameter and the circumference and the area and the perimeter. And let's make sure you really understand how these things are different and how to find them, on a 2D object before we go throw you into 3-dimensional space.
Can we talk real quick about going back? Because this is hard for kids when they've gone from like being moved along grade to grade because they're getting older. But then they're put into a mastery-based program where all of these learning gaps like really become very apparent. And we have parents at Prenda that say, they've always gotten straight A's. Why are you telling me that they're at a second grade level? It's like, well, there were learning gaps that grading schema wasn't picking up, right? And we do need to move back. And that's hard mentally, emotionally for kids and for parents. So what has your experience been? And what advice would you give in that situation? How to help kids, how to help parents?
It's a very similar experience. I would say like student experience first. It is very detrimental to their self-esteem, right? I thought that I was this brilliant person, and all of a sudden you're telling me that I don't know anything and I have to go all the way back, especially if I'm looking to my peers, right? They're so peer oriented that if I have somebody next to me who's actually in 5th grade when I'm in 2nd grade, oh my gosh, the embarrassment that comes from it. And again, I think parents will always cite like, oh, straight A's mean that I understand everything. I would love to challenge parents to go and sit down and take some of these tests and say, okay, well, what's your retention like? And, let's basically have you go through these hoops and hurdles. I think there's different ways that programs can go about this. At Alpha, not GT school, but at Alpha, we tackled it kind of on two fronts. So they would still make academic progress in, let's say, geometry, and they would have additional math work that was going back. We are able, I think, to see at the standard level, which is probably something you look at Prenda, right? Which is what standards kind of have this overlap. Let's have you avoid those ones and work on things that you do have mastery in. So just because you don't know area and perimeter doesn't mean that you're not great with linear equations. So we're going to push you forward on that, and then also fill in the gaps in a different area. I think that was probably more helpful for self-esteem, but I know that there is an argument also to say, like, let's just go back to basics and make sure that foundation is really strong before we push into new content. And I really think it just depends on where in the scaffolding and understanding they are in that subject.
What about the idea of grades? Because as you're talking about, if we didn't have first grade, second grade, third grade, I'm wondering if some of that would be mitigated because we wouldn't have, like, oh, I'm supposed to be in first grade. Because I find that with like my homeschooler, people will ask him like, what grade are you in? And he's like, well, I I calculated all the different levels that I'm working on, and I would say I'm about an eighth grader. And like he like took like that. He's like, I'm like, in a third grade writing, 12th grade reading. He was like, so let's just average it. And it's so funny to me. But it also, what I've noticed with him is because he was in traditional school environment, and then even at Prenda, he still was considered a grade level, that sometimes he's like, yeah, but I did this in third grade, or like, I don't want to have to go back to that. It creates this like mindset. And so that's why I really like he uses Right Start Math, and they use letters. It's like you're in level G. Like, what does level G mean? And so he can't argue with me on, well, I'm supposed to be in eighth grade, but this is sixth grade, or whatever the grades are. So I'm wondering how much that plays into the mindset of the kids feeling like a failure as well, is because we've pigeonholed them into these, grade levels.
I am actually not opposed to grade levels. Alpha, we had levels that encompassed multiple grade levels, but the kids still knew what grade they were in. I think there's a strong argument from a social component to have kids lumped together by age. I think developmentally, I could tell you some stories about why this is the best way to do it, because you do get those kids who are very smart, but very young, and they're not always ready for the content that they're being delivered. In a perfect world, I would love it if content was a little bit more flexible as far as, what I could engage with at what level. I do think that kids tend to kind of fly through the reading levels very fast. And why should I gate them from reading things that are complex just because they're in first grade? Equally, I think math is one of those things where you can see kids really scale and they can get super far ahead. I do think there's kind of a wall towards some of the higher level math concepts in high school, especially when we get into like the abstract thinking. Honestly, I just feel like grades are always going to exist. It's an easy way to, communicate with parents. Do I really want to be fixated on what grade this child should be in? Probably not. And I would say if they're concerned about having to do something again, my favorite argument for kids who I think are, I know everything, is, okay, well, if you know it so well, show me twice. And that's the argument I would use for your son, which is, I know you learned this in third grade, so it should already be in there and you should get through this so much faster, and there should be no questions.
Yeah, it's hard with him though, because he has what's called PDA. It's on the spectrum, so that's a demand to him. So then he shuts down even more. So I've tried little tools like that. I have to get very, very creative with him specifically. Yes, but I love like that I'm hearing. It's still good, especially because of understanding where kids are socially and emotionally. That is very different. Or if you have a first grader reading 12th grade content, like that is not appropriate with where they are. So I do think there is benefit in that, but I do wonder sometimes, what if we didn't like just that the grade becomes their identity. I feel like so much of like for me, like I feel like I have very specific memories of which grade I was in, and that became part of my identity. I feel like we can tease that out a little bit, I guess, is the point I was trying to get to.
Yeah, I don't know. I think Alpha did this maybe naturally, so it didn't come out the first time around. But I feel like when we're thinking about grade levels, we as adults who've gone through traditional education have this fixed mindset that because I'm in a grade level, I am experiencing certain content. I don't believe that that's the case. I think grade level should be what social and emotional experiences
Yes,
am I going through?
absolutely.
And separately, there's going to be content that should be delegated throughout my experience, K through 12, when it's appropriate. I would say if you have a very apt 12-year-old who wants to go dive into some teen literature, that becomes a different conversation, right? What conversations for the social and emotional well-being do I need to have with her before she dives into content that is probably not age appropriate? But content and age experience, I think those two things can be separated out pretty comfortably.
Definitely, especially in a personalized learning mastery-based program, right? Because you don't have to, everyone can be around. That's one of the things I love about our micro school is that the kids can be from a age range, like third to fifth, third to sixth, like a small range, and then they can be sitting around the same table running their own race academically, right? And so I would love to see what you said, like more flexibility in the content. Like, what if instead of, this tool feels like it's for a second grader because it's teaching what we've seen as second grade content. What if you could have a content stream that went K to 12 in every age stream? So I could have a K to 12 content that's designed for a 5-year-old, designed for a 7-year-old, right? So you could run that whole path, even if you were, not progressing, you're progressing more quickly or slower than your age.
Yes. If I could get a company to just magically listen to me, I'm like Lexia. You have Lexia Learning and Lexia Power Up. Lexia Learning has some great content that some of my older kids would really benefit from. But if I put them on that versus Power Up, the embarrassment that comes out of it, I think is really hard. So I would say to developers, can you give me multiple dashboard UI UX experiences that I can kind of slot onto content to help the self-esteem of our children? Because ultimately, if they feel good about it, their experience is going to be a lot better.
And can I get some really complex literature that's appropriate for a 6-year-old, but is at an 8th grade level? Like that's the future of education. We need to be pushing on that front too. Because as we personalize learning, we are going to see kids operating in wildly different framings than they have in the past, right? So we need to prepare for that. What advice would you give to parents or teachers looking to bring more technology into their learning spaces?
I would say for a traditional K-12 environment, if I was going to talk to teachers, I would say I would look for moments of natural struggle. Where are those pressure points that you want to be alleviated? Because I guarantee there is an education technology tool out there for you. I told you my sister is a teacher in middle school. She does a lot of check-ins with her theater students. And so she was kind of being over indoctrinated with passing out the paper and collecting them and then trying to put the information into a space where she could analyze it. And I politely sent her 15 different options where you can do this virtually. You need one iPad. If you don't have one, you can set it up and it can be one person's phone that goes around the room, but it will do all of the analysis for you. And so I would say look for those moments, because the truth is if you are looking to alleviate your own struggle, that's going to be the most natural time to bring in technology. I would say from an administrative standpoint, I would really look at kind of like overarching goals, and I would pick probably one area to focus on. I think when we try to adopt too many technologies, or we're replacing too many things with technologies, it has a really low success rate. So if your school in particular struggles with reading, let's become an expert on reading technologies, and let's bring in 2 or 3, or look to schools like Prenda and Alpha who naturally have these pieces integrated, and leverage kind of the resources and training that they've done, because they're working with these intimately every day.
That is really, really great advice. And so we are running out of time, and I think my kids are going to be very thankful that I talked to you today. Whenever my son comes home needing to get on the nitro time so that he can collect whatever he's collecting on there. No, I need to know what he's collecting on there. So you're helping me a lot. So we ask this question to every guest that we have on the KindlED podcast. So who is someone who has kindled your love of learning, curiosity, motivation, or passion?
I was fortunate to have nothing but wonderful teachers in my life. So I could go through every teacher since second grade and call them out by name. And I do tip my hat to them. But I would say honestly that my kids at Alpha, they kindled my own love of learning. And I feel like getting to watch them struggle and have questions every day. I mean, it still fuels me, and I'm not even in the classroom. I'm constantly reaching out to them because I just want to know how they're doing. So in particular, I'd love to shout out, my kids, Gideon and Sawyer and Elle and Kate and Grace and Peyton and Parker and Rhett and Benjamin, and Sloan, Hope. I don't know. Clara, they're all wonderful kids. And I got to spend intimate time watching them learn and fail, and their resilience. It was the best time of my life, and so I'm just grateful for being in school. School life is the best.
Why am I tearing up as you like you said all those names? I was like, those are real lives, real children, and your relationship with them matters so much. So as you're saying each name, I was like, okay, I need to wipe my eyes.
I love it. All right. How can listeners learn more about your work?
I'm kind of a social media enigma, so you can find me on LinkedIn. Sometimes I'll post on, I guess it's X now. So probably there. Or you can check out the Kinjo blog. I write a few of those.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been a super interesting educational conversation. We really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's it for today. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the KindlED Podcast. If this episode was helpful to you, please like, subscribe, and follow us on social at PrendaLearn. If you have a question you'd like us to address, please just email us at podcast@prenda.com. You can also join our Facebook group. It's called the KindlED Collective. It is a private group, but come on over and we will accept you into the group. And you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Sunday Spark.
The KindlED Podcast is brought to you by Prenda. Prenda makes it easy for you to start and run an amazing micro school based on all of the things we talk about here on the KindlED Podcast. If you want more information about guiding a Prenda micro school, go to prenda.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep kindling.